Alright everyone, we start off today with a refutation of critical race theory. We finally have an article in which leftoids are willing to specifically define what it is, because I see all sorts of off-the-wall stuff. One thing they never admit to is the Marxist element, of course, but Vox very helpfully does in a quasi-lie by structure, actually, in this article, because it's buried halfway down the article for a reason. Link in the description, archived, of course. You can read along with me. I'm going to be refuting the 5 main points of critical race theory, as well as the most broad, overarching concept, which is the concept of systemic racism building the United States and race being injected into everything. As we'll see, that's not really the case. First and foremost, though, if you're watching this video on YouTube, take a look down below. There will be a pinned comment. It'll have links to 4 other video hosting sites that I use. Today I'll be making a 3rd YouTube video. Generally, I only make 2, and then I make 2 additional videos that are just on these other 4 sites. They don't go on YouTube. They're either too edgy, or there's too many videos, and YouTube punishes you if you make more than 2 videos in a 24-hour period normally. Unless they're really juicy, hot topics like McAfee dying, I keep it at 2, generally speaking, unless it's a literary update. Now, the first point of critical race theory is the concept that systemic racism pervades every element of U.S. culture. That this systemic racism is from white people, specifically aimed at all other groups of people, and that this is the best way of explaining inequality and various problems. Now, the first thing is this. This only even approaches truth if you take the most loose and broad definition of what racism is. So it's not, you literally dislike or have a visceral reaction to people or attempt to disenfranchise or harm them or harass them based on the color of their skin or some real or perceived ethnicity. This would be the equivalent, in its expansive form, of saying that there's systemic misogyny because someone was manspreading on the subway. Because of microaggressions, because of packaging label being the wrong color, you got offended by so like Aunt Jemima pancake syrup or something. If you are very easily offended, or if you are disingenuous and looking for reasons to see racism, you will find it. If I look for evil in the world, and I have a very expansive definition of what evil is, I'm going to consider the world a fairly dark and foreboding place. If I, however, take a step back and say, okay, maybe I can constrain my definition to something a little bit more reasonable, like something that actually is meaningful and not microaggressions or your hot dog weighed half an ounce less than that dude's and it must have been because of the color of your skin. You were shorted on your hot dog weight or something. If I forgo that, the number of racism incidents drops precipitously. I would also say, in refutation of this, you have an upswelling of racism aimed at white people. Critical race theory is part of that. Now, I'm not going to say like, whoa, it's just anti-white ahistorical stuff. Well, maybe so. But it does happen. The whole precursor idea that racism can't be aimed at whites because of empowerment or privilege overlooks individuality. The whole of this is basically communism in the sense of looking at people as aggregated wholes. We see this with the wage gap argument too. The wage gap disappears if you look at any individual particular kind of job. It only matters at all if you don't take into consideration different lifestyle choices based on aggregates of individuals. In an individual sense, therefore, critical race theory, or people who believe in this sort of thing, would posit that a barefoot dude on welfare living in Appalachia who happens to be of white ancestry is more privileged than a black heart surgeon with a $250,000 salary living in a penthouse. The fact is that it can only exist as a theory if you only look at collectives. This overlooks another huge problem, which is that if you're trying to solve this potential problem that you've identified, which is systemic racism, you're not going to win any allies by overlooking those individuals that have fallen through and happen to be white, or in some cases now East Asian. They've become the model minority mythology for the left. So that's a refutation of the concept of systemic racism. Also, keep in mind, skyscrapers are not built out of cotton. The idea that the United States only became wealthy and successful because of slavery and Jim Crow, okay, why are there so many successful nations that much earlier abolished slavery and never had segregation? Why is that the case? Why is it that there are nations that have never been run by white people that are still brutally huge amounts of wealth inequality and warfare and so forth? Of course, the critical race theory would posit colonialism. What about areas that weren't really colonized? What about areas in which the colonists actually built a bunch of infrastructure and really weren't oppressing people at all, and sort of happened to claim the area? Of course, the British occasionally did this in some of their more enlightened moments. I suppose the Belgians did the opposite, and that could be a reason why Congo is specifically overrun by violence at the moment. And in full admission, just saying the Belgians did it worse. But anyway, I'm going to take you through these 5 points. Now, this is from Vox. And keep in mind, this is buried halfway down the article. Point number 4, there's a reason why it's buried so far down. The whole first half of the article is basically saying that anyone who opposes critical race theory is a disinfo agent or far right. Well, not really, but that's the claim. The problem is one of the central reasons people oppose it is actually literally admitted to in point number 4 here. So I'll get to that, but I'm going to do them in order. I'm going to read them verbatim. First point. First, the group was skeptical of legal theories that supported colorblindness, objectivity, and neutrality, which created an abstracted story of racial inequality as a series of randomly occurring, intentional, and individualized acts. In other words, the scholars wanted the legal field to think of racism on a scale much larger than one-to-one interactions. Racism could never be a random act because race was socially constructed for the purpose of oppression. To be objective is to support the status quo, and thus the country isn't working actively to redress racial inequalities. Now, this is actually an easily refuted point, because it's self-refuting. The problem is that you're trying to take a legal field constructed by a bunch of supposedly systemically racist white people and empower it to take away the systemic oppression. You're saying that colorblindness is actually a bad thing, and yet even acknowledging that racial hierarchy that's been created is to delve into the hierarchy created which was done for oppressive purposes, as these people are openly stating. They have refuted themselves in the course of a few short sentences on 2 totally different counts. It almost boggles the mind that you would even need to refute this, because it literally it destroys the argument literally implodes. It's self-destructive. You engage in the racial hierarchy, acknowledge it in order to fight it, through a legal system, both of which were constructed for racist purposes. The first for oppression, the second as an offshoot of that, according to critical race theory. So let's give it more power. This is like saying the government is causing a bunch of war. Let's give this group tied to the government a bunch of money because they say that they're peace activists. Doesn't really work. Point number 2. Second, the scholars stated that every analysis of law should be grounded in historical context, arguing that racism has contributed to all contemporary manifestations of group advantage and disadvantage along racial lines, including differences in income, imprisonment, health, housing, education, political representation, and military service. The last part is not necessarily true. We'll get into that especially. For example, the black-white race gap, which exists because black people have historically been excluded from wealth-building measures like home ownership, hasn't changed since researchers started collecting related data more than 50 years ago. The typical white family is almost 10 times wealthier than the average black one. Now, again, first and foremost, we go to the individual refutation. This does not take into example individual circumstances. It only takes into advantage non-individual circumstances. Secondly, it doesn't take into consideration lifestyle choices. The fact is that many urban individuals are more poor, this includes white people, than people outside of those zones. If you were to fix by looking at inner city neighborhoods versus suburban neighborhoods, the gap would be probably larger. There is definitely a racial component to that, but this is not always by default the result of the economy. In some cases, it's the result of a crepitating lifestyle. And in some cases, that's been promulgated actually by leftists. The cat's trying to distract me from the video as usual. It's been promulgated by high centrality, and it's sort of like the problem you have in Native American reservations. Now, keep in mind, Native Americans, so-called, everyone's indigenous if they were born on the continent, in my opinion. They're created. People are given literally free things by the government, given wide-reaching tribal legal authority, semi-separate from the normal legal system, completely separate in some cases. You have limitless tax-free casino income coming in, the ability to self-govern on a significant level. You have a society that's not run by evil white people and hasn't been for quite some time, for multiple generations. Yet you have among the highest systemic poverty, the highest systemic crime. It's not the result of white people making racist policies. It's the result of corruption due to centralized systems because centralized systems happen to be corrupt. If, therefore, you have a racial group that tends to congregate in cities which tend towards higher rates of corruption, higher rates of crime and incarceration, there's a higher population density, which means more of a likelihood they are going to get drug dealers and pimps and stuff simply because they're going where there are enough people to have a clientele. Yes, you're going to get problems. That divide begins to shrink, though, if you were to take into consideration blacks versus whites in a small town community. Blacks versus whites living in proximity within the same neighborhood. If you were to fix for whites that happen to live in those same crepitating inner city neighborhoods, as a very large proportion of the black population, that gap begins to shrink considerably. But the fact is that that gap's not going to go anywhere so long as the lifestyle choices, which are individually driven in many cases, some cases they're subculturally driven, it's on case 2, and that's unfortunate, are addressed. But that's not systemic racism. The whites in those communities are just as disempowered. I would say it's very funny they'd bring up military service. Black people outsizedly are military members. That comes with a host of benefits. That comes with, the pay in the military itself may not be great, but once you get out, college money, differential hiring and so forth, being a veteran, especially a combat veteran, that's really good reason to hire the person because the idea is they know discipline and stuff. Why is it as well that if we look, for instance, at marginalized white communities, like the Irish Americans, who, by and large, are only 4 or 5 generations in, came during a famine with literally nothing and were promptly in serfdom or drafted into the Civil War. Why is it that those Irish Americans shared in so much more wealth? Well, they didn't start off with homes. They weren't going out into farmland and managing to eke out an existence. They weren't like the Norwegian diaspora or something like the Prussian diaspora. They came over in severest need and settled in largely urban East Coast areas where there was pervasive racism against them. If you look at some of the stuff from the 1800s against the Irish, my goodness, it makes some of the shit from Jim Crow blush. And yet you don't have that same gap happening. Well, there was still a marginalized community well into the 20th century. Italian Americans face similar things. What about groups, for instance, with wealth? If we're going to look at aggregates, I'm only supposed to talk about aggregates and averages, not about individuals. What about South Asians? Indian Americans are the single wealthiest group per capita in the United States. They are not white. Not by and large. They're what like a Richard Spencer would call them ethnic or something, like brown people. The Democrats will be pandering to them, calling them that too at any time. No, it's because of the kind of people that tended to come over and the immigration-related situation. But if they were facing systemic discrimination, they shouldn't have been able to eke out so much wealth. What about East Asians? They're not of Caucasian origin. People of Japanese heritage as well. Jews. Jews overall are more wealthy than non-Jewish whites in the United States. They have more wealth per capita, despite fairly notorious amounts of bigotry aimed at them at every possible level for several hundred years. Why is it then that they managed to make it? And people from Japan, second, third gen, South Asia, why is it that these people were able to make it in the great melting pot of the United States, and yet you have certain groups that are marginalized? It's not because of systemic racism. It wasn't that long ago, it wasn't even 100 years ago, that the only socialist president that we ever had rounded up every Japanese American, including citizens, and put them in concentration camps. Somehow they still managed to make it. It boggles the mind in such a systemically racist system now, doesn't it? Third, the theorist wrote that critical race theory acknowledges, values, and centers the knowledge of people of color who experience racism daily. We've already talked about this point. Only if you use the broadest possible explanation of what racism is. If you take a very broad and expansive view of racism, if racism is the fact that I'm wearing this because somebody who believes in the boogaloo belatedly decided to jump on the latest fashion trend, by the way, I was wearing these months before that was a meme, then I guess that can be a sign of racism. If you consider certain words, like I guess picnic is now a problematic word, because its very archaic usage had to do with lynching, supposedly, and I don't even know that that's actually linguistically the case. I'm wondering whether that's historically accurate. Literally nobody would possibly know that, and literally nobody could possibly find a reason to be averse to the use of the term except for some goddamn egghead digging around in books from the 1800s and finding something to be tragically and astonishingly angry at. It's the only kind of person that would even know that that was a thing. If that's your definition of racism, yeah, I guess every fucking person, regardless of color, including whites, it's a barrage of racism. YouTube's racist, the cat's racist, my shirt's racist, the computer's racist. You know, the QWERTY keyboard is somehow racist. Ice cream is racist. Peanut butter is racist. I'm appropriating black culture because of that dude who invented like 100 different uses for peanuts. He happened to be black and didn't get enough credit for it. The table's racist. Oh, it's square because of white supremacy, and it's white space basically because it has corners to divide people from one another, and it doesn't take into consideration mid-1700s African tea culture or something. If you look at the world through that lens, and if you believe in CRT, certainly you do, and you boil everything down to racism, yeah, everything's racist. Everyone faces day-to-day racism on 10 different levels. If you say racism is actual bigotry, actual mistreatment, actual harassment, actual assault, actual disenfranchisement by the legal system, no, you don't. You don't face day-to-day racism. Nobody cares about your race except for the people that are pushing critical race theory so that they can write more books and make a lot of money off of it. This is what these groups tend to do. Number 4, and this is one I'll focus on in regards to the article structure as well. Next, the scholars noted that critical race theory is interdisciplinary and eclectic, meaning it borrowed from a number of traditions, like feminism, Marxism, and critical legal theory. The thinkers argued that a combination of these ideas strengthened their framework. Again, if you are honest and forthcoming about the fact that Marxism played a role in critical race theory, which is something that the online liberal crowd, like the grift left and the breadliners, are not forthcoming about, I guess. Certainly not the so-called anti-SJW left. If you're honest, I don't think the average American would look too kindly on that. Now, why on earth, therefore, would Vox bury this list, which actually says what critical race theory is, halfway down the fucking article after 5 different paragraphs of saying, well, that's just bullshit. It's disinfo to say that communism has anything to do with this. It's about racial justice. Well, no, they were borrowing from Marxist tradition. They're openly acknowledging it. But you see, Vox is lying by structure. They don't want the readers to absorb that. They have to put it in there as one of the key points of CRT, but they don't have to put it at the front. Because then if you put it at the front, all of a sudden Tucker Carlson has a segment. Oh yeah, look what Vox wrote the other day, but he's not going to see that because nobody's going to forward it to him because nobody bothered to read the whole article. I encounter this all the time. I've been shown articles before, and this is not just by leftists, by the way, that literally refute their own content, especially from Vox and HuffPost and some of these sites. The Blaze as well, too, notorious for this. You'll have 5 or 6 paragraphs saying something, and then the last paragraph will basically debase the entirety of the rest of the screed that's been written there, and nobody realizes it. So I get like a news tip, and I have to read through the whole fucking thing, because otherwise I might be reporting something that's flat out wrong, that's admitted to be wrong in the article. And then one of the other randomly assembled handful of nerds out there will point out that Styx Hexenhammer was wrong, and then I have to take the video down, and it wastes my time. Lastly, they identified critical race theory's goal, eliminating racial oppression as a step towards eliminating all oppression. A noble goal, at least. The interests of all people of color necessarily require not just adjustments within the established hierarchies, but a challenge to hierarchy itself. Again, here's the problem. The legal methodology, critical legal theory, by which you're attempting to do this is essentially self-defeating. You are attempting to use a system that you have identified as systemically tainted with racism and run by racists for racists by racists. That the United States is literally a shining white city on the hill. You're attempting to use that government and legal system to destroy its own corruption and oppression. That's impossible, though. A house divided against itself cannot stand. What you're trying to do, and it's like you're trying to cast out demons in the name of Satan at that point, to use an antiquated term for this basic concept. It won't work. It makes no sense whatsoever. You've identified the system as bad and wrong, but you're trying to use its power to correct its own badness and wrongness. And by the way, a lot of the people engaging in the critical race theory thing, well, they happen to be white. I wonder why. Could it be because they've written a dozen books and they want to grift and get them on the New York Times best-selling list? See, that the only equality they want is they want to be equal to the other rich people. It's the whole point. If you think that by and large the goal is to actually solve racism, it's not. The problem is that the stated goal of such movements is always going to be different from the actual goal. We've got this problem with activism in general. Activistic groups usually spring up, they're very meritocratic, they're trying to do a good thing, and within 10, 15, 20 years, they fall through and they become corrupted, because what happens is that if they actually solve the problem they were meant to solve, if the problem is actually goes away, then they have to find something else to do, something to whine about, or they just don't solve the problem from the get-go. This won't solve the problem of racism. If anything, CRT is opposing the actual solution, which is literally colorblindness. Literally, if you're going to demarcate the racial system and the legal system springing therefrom, or conjoined to it, the only way to win the game is not to play it. You're playing the game using the same labels, using the same concepts. You're trying to co-opt the same supposedly systemically bigoted legal system to defeat bigotry. It'll never work. It's a sham. It's a con. I'm very glad that Vox, therefore, however, admitted to the fact that Marxism was part of CRT, because at all of these town meetings and school board meetings, that's never admitted to. In the meeting in Vermont, where parents, in Rutland no less, my hometown, are like, well, you know, we're not so sure about this CRT thing. They're like, well, we're not really teaching critical race theory, just elements of it. Well, you're teaching elements of something that is, according to people, academics, these are the scholars, so we have to trust them, right? According to the actual published, peer-reviewed intellectual wonks that are developing the concept of critical race theory, they borrowed from Marxism. And feminism. Not sure whether second or third wave. The latter would rankle some people. The former, nobody gives a shit at this point. They're openly declaring this. To be clear, Marxism is involved with it. Well, there you go. 2 of the 5 main points are self-refuting. Points number 1 and 5 on here destroy themselves. Point number 4 admits to what is not being admitted to, at least openly, by the politicians and the policymakers and the school board meeting members and stuff that are pushing critical race theory. They're saying it's a disinfo campaign by Nazis to say Marxism has anything to do with this, but you've got an open admission therefrom. The other points fall flat simply because you're trying to fight fire with fire. The whole goal can never be achieved by critical race theory. What we were doing basically in the 90s, which is watching Sesame Street and Big Bird told us we're basically all the same and that we shouldn't worry about people's color of skin and we should judge them by the content of their character. Where have we heard that one? That helps. That's how you get people together. That's how you don't drive people apart and you have a better society. Simply saying there's inequality and white people it's their fault that that's the case is not going to jive with the average white person, because they're not advantaged and privileged. They're not millionaires and stuff. And when we look at racial demographics, the entire argument falls apart anyway. White Anglo-Saxons are number 4 on the wealth list. So what gives? Several Asian groups and then Jews are ahead of them. Why is this? They were all oppressed at similar levels. Why then is it all over the board? Is it based on like skin tone? Like, okay, well, yeah, they're Japanese, so they're not, white, but they're light-colored, and so they got a pass? No, they didn't. In the 40s, they were literally locked up in internment camps, concentration camps by a different name. Illegally, by the way. Fucking Richard Nixon had to apologize for that one. And I love how they talk about the wealth gap in the last 50 years. So you mean the gap that has been stubborn for literally every group since the war on poverty began. So when the government started trying to solve a problem by various flawed methods, by appropriating more resources, paid for by taxes, and stifled the economy and prevented growth, you mean during that period things by and large didn't improve for black Americans? Well, they didn't improve that much for white Americans either. We're having a whole national conversation about the wealth gap between the super, super rich and literally everybody else regardless of their race. The fact that their boomer parents managed to get a shit shack put up, a cheap house that they could afford back then with 3 years half salary, is kind of neither here nor there. If anything, that bubble's going to blow up in a lot of white people's faces fairly soon. So there, I've refuted critical race theory according to a supposedly journalistic group on a mainline left-leaning news network. So now the breadliners and stuff can make their hit pieces about why I'm somehow wrong. They see racism everywhere because they're trying to grift. That's about all. Peace out.